Now, leading our bulletin this hour, the eradication of poverty and hunger was debated as a matter of importance at the National Council of Provinces this week, with delegates discussing the expansion of mechanisms aimed at mitigating the social challenges. The NCOP also looked at issues such as housing and democracy as guided by the Freedom Charter. An estimated 60% of households in the country are living below the poverty line, with many of them being child-headed households. Mismanagement and corruption were highlighted as factors undermining government's social welfare efforts. Some MPs also felt that policies such as the contentious VAT hike are detrimental and anti-poor.
We must shift from temporary relief to long-term recovery. Our social safety nets must not only protect the vulnerable, but provide the tools for individuals and households to rebuild and thrive. Social support must be linked to development.
All right, now joining us to discuss the issue of hunger and poverty is Professor Alex van der Heever. He's chair in the field of social security at Wits School of Governance. Professor, good evening. Thank you very much for your time. Now, Professor, hunger and poverty are significant problems in South Africa. Parliamentarians, of course, debated this worrying situation this week. But before we look at the possible solutions, I'd like for us to properly characterize the problem or diagnose the problem, because some say it's not a question of food shortages. The country produces and imports all the food it needs, meaning that we're possibly dealing here with unequal access to food. Just talk us through the root cause of the levels of hunger we continue to report on.
Well, part of the problem is a distributional one, which is consistent with what you've just said. A distributional problem occurs where, you will produce enough, but how do you get it to the people who are in need? And part of the problem is access to income. And at this point in time, with such high levels of unemployment, the key mechanism by which we enable people to access resources and food, etc., and housing is through income, through labor. And if they don't have that, then they suffer the consequence. They suffer an inability to cope with these problems. So we have to compensate for that with other forms of distributing income. Those are the social grants and various forms of social protection. And that is now not a distribution of income through employment, but is actually a distribution through government transfers. So there's a question as to whether that is sufficient, but it's also where it's indicative of a problem that our economy is also suffering an absence of effective growth.
And that
is
really
actually a core problem.
Indeed, because we can hear the call that there must be an expansion of social grant system and extending the school nutrition program. But the reality is that South Africa is caught in the middle of a low growth trap, which results in considerable fiscal constraints. So one wonders if that kind of a call for the expansion of social grants is actually one that should be considered given our economic issues.
Well, we have to do both. I think what we are seeing is that we've got our government policy on achieving economic growth is failing. We can't do without the social supports that compensate for the absence of adequate access to employment. But when we do focus on economic growth, we actually have to succeed with those measures, and we're not doing so. The extent of corruption in South Africa has severely undermined economic growth potential. Is a very significant deviation from our long-term growth trajectory in 2008, and we haven't recovered from that. And we're probably down about a third of our GDP from where we should have been. So that is definitely a major contributor. But we also do need to make sure that despite that, we do protect people given this impasse. But we've got to solve the problem of economic growth. And we also can't just leave people abandoned because of government's failure to provide economic growth.
Beyond that element of dealing with the economic growth issue, there's then the food waste. This one is honestly disheartening. I mean, 10 million tons of food is discarded annually, and that amounts to a third of the country's 31 million tons of food that are produced. Government, we know even yesterday, committed yet again to halve this figure by 2030, and it's of course part of the Sustainable Development Goal 12.3. But are we on track to achieve this? Because one would say this is the low-hanging fruit. Just deal with the food wastage.
Well, it then depends on government systems of transfer. You've basically got to take food surpluses and transfer them to people who need them. if we again can't get government to actually distribute food or to carry out any program without significant levels of corruption and inefficiency, then we face problems there. Many of our basic functions are not working, so we've got to get them to work if we're going to compensate for that. Our best method, easiest method to actually get people to access food and their meet their basic necessities is to ensure that they have incomes in their hands. So it doesn't become a government program to put food in their hands through another means. But we're not succeeding with either strategy at this point in time. But there's no one single measure. But certainly we are in a position to provide sufficient food for everybody in South Africa. But our distribution systems, our method of getting stuff from A to B has to be really, we need a safe platform for that to happen, and we don't.
Professor, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying nevertheless, we are in a position to somewhat contribute more positively and deal with the hunger issue even now, even with the low growth.
We do. Look, there's always the potential to do that. We're looking at very, very basic needs, and these basic needs can be satisfied. But our problem is that we're getting more and more fragile as an economy and a society as we don't deal with a number of our fundamental core issues. That's the scary bit taking us forward. We can't always try and solve these problems when they get so big. We've got to reduce the scale of these problems in order to be able to manage them effectively. But we have no choice. We've got to protect people now. And we're going to have to ensure that when we take steps forward going from now, that we do actually get economic growth going. But we're not really seeing that happen. But we're also in a position where fiscally government is struggling. And government is also struggling fiscally because it's not spending its funds very efficiently or effectively. And that's placing government into a position of fiscal vulnerability. The debt servicing now exceeds the value of social grants in South Africa. So just the servicing of the debt is now in a problem. And we can't have a fiscal debt spiral occur. Then we're moving from one crisis to another, and we're not able to manage all of the accumulating crises that are emerging because we're not getting the basics right.
A very scary picture that you paint there, Professor, but thank you very much for your insights this evening. That's Professor Alex van der Heever there speaking to us following that debate by the NCOP on hunger and poverty.